Tammy's been has been at the Postal Service since 2005, when she started as an audit director and spent her earlier career at the Treasury Department. She has her degree from W.J. Bryan College and is a certified public accountant. She's been a very good friend of Lexington for more than a few years, and I'm glad to have you here. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Matt Carey and the Lexington Institute for inviting me to speak today. The topic of postal reform is incredibly important, and at the same time, it's very challenging. One of the fundamental questions that needs to be addressed is how do we define the Universal Service Obligation, USO? I'm here today to talk about some of the work that the Postal Service Office of Inspector General has done on the topic of the USO. The purpose of the USO is to ensure that the Postal Service provides a minimum level of service to all areas of the country. Except for the requirement to deliver 6 days a week, there's really no clear definition of the Postal Service's USO. It is generally assumed to be a collection of various laws and regulations. Both the Postal Service and the Postal Regulatory Commission agree on some baseline aspects of what the USO encompasses. It encompasses geographic scope, range of products, access, delivery mode and frequency, pricing, and service. The PRC also adds user rights, or the complaint process, to the USO, and the Postal Service adds security. Within each attribute, except for the 6-day-a-week delivery, there's little agreement on what the Postal Service is required to provide. This lack of a clear definition makes it difficult for the Postal Service and the PRC to determine if proposed changes in service will meet the needs of the America's public postal service. For years, the lack of a clear USO was not really problematic. However, the rise of digital alternatives and the resulting decline in hard copy mail has made it challenging for the Postal Service to finance its operations. As the Postal Service struggles financially, it calls into question what postal services the American public still needs. In its 2008 report on the USO, the PRC recommended that the policymakers should take a more comprehensive review of the USO. This need for a comprehensive review is what motivated the OIG to do a series of 3 papers that explored the USO in different ways. These papers, if you're interested, are available on our website at USPSOIG.gov. Our first paper, in 2014, developed a set of guiding principles that could be used to create a USO that is relevant and sustainable for the postal services in the United States. These guiding principles were a result of synthesizing the lessons learned from other posts and industries. While these guiding principles will not lead to easy answers, it is our hope that our work will materially contribute to the ongoing discussion of the USO. I'll talk first about the guiding principles, and then I'll quickly touch on 2 additional papers that we issued on the subject. The first guiding principle that we came up with was to update and clarify the purpose of the USO to focus on the requirements needed to meet policy goals. This may sound simple, but it's not. One needs to understand the policy goals before updating the USO. For example, if the policy goal is the policy goal limited to ensuring hard copy communication across the nation? If so, then it follows that the USO only needs to cover the letters and flats products. Or is the policy goal broader, to ensure both hard copy communication and an affordable alternative to private sector e-commerce deliveries? If so, then the USO should cover parcels as well. The second guiding principle is the USO should define the minimum level of service, but the Postal Service should be allowed to provide service above the USO minimums. For example, a USO requirement could be to provide delivery 5 days a week, which would set the minimum, but it should not prohibit the Postal Service to deliver more often when it can do so and remain financially stable. The floor does not necessarily have to be the same for all products or geographic areas of the country. For example, in other countries, there's a different frequency of delivery requirement to rural and urban areas. The third guiding principle is the USO should be flexible enough to enable adaptation to changing market conditions over multiple years. Getting a new USO defined will be a lengthy and controversial process, requiring significant time and resources. So it is essential for the USO to be flexible enough to last for years. The fourth guiding principle is the USO should be defined in terms of the service received and not how the service is provided. The basic idea here is to not preclude the Postal Service from using alternative means and methods to provide the service as long as it can meet obligations and that these alternatives are acceptable to its customers. For example, other posts have requirements about the number of access points needed, but they're allowed to meet those requirements using alternatives to postal-owned post offices. These alternatives might include things like kiosks, postal counters, and other businesses and outsourced post offices. Although, here in the United States, it's questionable whether those alternatives would be acceptable. The fifth guiding principle that we came up with is the USO needs to be financially sustainable while reasonably priced. We need to acknowledge that the obligations create costs, and these costs are borne by the Postal Service and ultimately by the ratepayers. It's quite possible that society, American society, may value more services than the Postal Service can fund. If this happens, policymakers will need to determine if the needs are great enough to justify alternative funding mechanisms. For example, in the UK, the government provides a subsidy to allow Royal Mail to keep rural post offices open. The sixth guiding principle is USO requirements should be transparent and measurable. For a new USO to be effective, the PRC, the Postal Service, and the public need to know if the obligation is being met. Policymakers will have to find the right balance between specificity and flexibility. While completing this first paper, we identified an area where further study was needed. A quantitative survey of what postal services people value the most, and that was the focus of our second paper. And we issued that in 2015. This might have been the toughest of the three. While there have been studies that ask postal customers what they want or do not want, these studies have been qualitative studies, studies that ask, would you or would you not support 5-day delivery? The findings from these studies are available, but it's very easy for respondents to simply say they value all postal services, especially when they don't have to consider any downside to receiving the service. Our study added a cost factor, an increase in the price of postage that forced the survey respondents to consider if that service was worth the extra cost, and to help determine the relative value of the attributes. We found in the study that both businesses and consumers place a high value on delivery to the door or to the curb versus a cluster box. Although a previous OIG survey found that rural customers value the security associated with the cluster box. The survey also found that postal consumers and businesses place a high value on interacting with a postal employee at a post office versus using a kiosk or an alternative postal location. However, the survey respondents did find that more limited postal hours of operation could be acceptable. When we presented our findings from the first two papers, stakeholders pointed out, quite rightly, that any comprehensive discussion of the USO needs to explore, as Megan said earlier, how to fund it. So that led us to our third USO paper that we issued in 2016. This paper noted that the combination of the decline in first-class mail volume and the price cap has challenged the ability of the Postal Service to fund its obligations, even with the postal monopolies. At the time we published this paper in 2016, there was seemingly little appetite to reduce the Postal Service's obligations. Therefore, we focused on ways to increase revenue. We looked at various funding alternatives and found three viable and not necessarily mutually exclusive alternatives. The first was increased pricing flexibility. The second was direct subsidy of targeted obligations. And third was diversification. To be clear, we did not recommend any alternative. We didn't recommend any alternative over any other alternative. Instead, we noted that policymakers should find the right balance between ensuring that Postal Service is obligated to provide the services that the American public needs and ensuring that the Postal Service has enough revenue to cover the cost of these obligations. As was noted by the President's task force, without a clearly defined USO, it is difficult for the Postal Service to make business decisions in a timely and efficient manner. We're working now on a fourth paper on the USO. It will draw upon our previous work as well as explore recent activity both in the United States and abroad, where interestingly enough, some posts have actually changed their USO in the past 5 years. We're hoping to publish this paper later in the spring, and that paper will also be posted on USPSOAG.gov. Thank you very much.
Thank you.